Can we hear, can we listen to the language of nature? As a result of the modern revolution, the early modern revolution, the Machiavellian revolution, we are raised with a peculiarly modern notion of nature. Nature is what is beyond the gods. Nature is what we study when we take a physics class. After all, physics comes from the word nature in Greek, physis. Nature. Perhaps we fantasize about it. But in any case, nature stands in juxtaposition to God. God is not needed to understand nature. In fact, God is very often, even the gods, provided they're read in terms of this authority that is overarching, that is imposed upon nature, God prevents us from heeding nature. So, in the modern context, we relate to nature, whatever that is, let's bracket this question for a second, in two ways. On the one hand, the formal scientific way, the empirical, strict way, the way of the exact hard sciences. They tell us, chemistry, biology, physics, you name it. They tell us what nature is all about. They expose the mechanisms of nature, the underlying mechanisms underlying our experience of nature. And then we have the experience itself. And so we have entertainment, we have talk, we have sentiment, we have feelings. We go out for a walk in the woods, we breathe the fresh air, and we say, that is nature. I have the experience of nature. The imagination, the world of the imagination, the world of dreams. How wonderful that is. How enchanting. So we have the sciences that will allow us to then go out and appreciate the smell of the roses, to be inebriated by, filled with the passions, yes, of, the spirit of nature. Right. Well, that is what we're used to today. But this is somewhat of a dream world within a modern matrix. What does it presuppose? We sometimes seek an authentic experience of nature. Well, in other words, a communion with nature. But what do we mean by nature? So let's get back to this question. Well, it might be helpful to see what was meant originally by nature, and then see how we got to our own notion, modern notion of nature, a notion that responds to a pre-modern situation. Well, first of all, the modern. Let's go back step by step. The modern notion of nature responds to a Christian notion of nature. We need to access Christian sources, study them closely in order to appreciate what is going on. But the Christian notion of nature, in turn, responds to a certain predicament. We could say a pagan or pre-Christian predicament. This predicament was tough to deal with. First of all, we have a very confused notion of nature. Then we have diatribes among the philosophers as to the true nature of nature. Nature, for one thing, this is fairly uncontroversial. is what grows. Right? It is what is alive. But it is also the principle of life. And so in fundamental respect, it is the mind of what we might call nature. And yet, the philosophers invented nature in the abstract. In other words, there were original philosophers of nature, as Aristotle calls them, and they posited a realm of nature, a realm of things, that is not that of the city, that is outside of the city and of its gods. In this realm, we have forces at play, and we're supposed to be able to hear the language of nature. Let's get to this rich, dense question, the language of nature. Pythagoras speaks of the music of the spheres. Ultimately, the nature that he is referring to, that he cares about, is something that the mind accesses. The music of the spheres is the language, even the logos of the spheres, which is to say, of the universe. How can we hear this language, this music of nature? And early philosophers, withdrew from ordinary speech. And they looked down upon, they frowned upon the language of the city. Right? In comes Socrates, and Socrates says, look, consider, for example, the Phaedrus, the dialogue by Plato. And Socrates says, look, I'm here, I see a tree, but I hear the locusts, and I don't understand their language. I make an effort. Poets vaguely understand or vaguely hear the divine in these things. The tree, the locust, even the clouds. In order to best understand the language of nature, I need to get back into the city, within the city walls, and heed the language of men, which, of course, he understands, is mediated by, poets. So it is fundamentally a poetic language. All right. So it is through poetry, through the poetic language, that we come to understand, to hear the language of nature. But then again, by nature, he does not mean something other than the divine. So, ultimately, nature is the realm of things themselves, filled with everything else. In other words, we have the various manifestations of nature. And so we have the gods, we have men, and so it is beginning from men that we begin to, that we hear, right, the language of heroes and of gods, and ultimately awaken to the mind underlying all of these manifestations, nature as mind or thought. Right? And so all language, all logos, a manifestation of a nous, of a mind, in Greek nous. And so the nous becomes, now is looked upon as father to a logos, which is son. And there is a single logos. Then again, in Christianity, this becomes most evident. There is one single logos that emanates from the mind. Well, what about then the modern response to Christianity? Christianity essentially stresses the unity of the Logos, because we had various conceptions of the Logos. And it stresses the fact that the Logos, that language, stems directly. It is not produced, created. It emanates. It is generated by, it emanates from mind, an unfettered, unerring mind, impersonal in itself, in the respect that it is hidden. So there is ultimately a primacy of what is hidden over what is manifest, even though manifestation, the manifestation of the hidden, acquires unparalleled, one might say, dignity. So it is irreducible. Right? So the unity of the manifestation of the mind is irreducible to any particular manifestation. Right? So in Christian terms, the Christ is irreducible to any avatar, right, that you might find in Hinduism, for instance. Right. Well, then we can hear the language of nature as the language of fundamental reality through the announcement of the Christ, through the various followers of the Christ, right? So through the poets who follow the single Logos, which is the direct manifestation and incarnation, if you like, of the mind of the universe. So, if we seek to understand nature, we do not go for a modern notion, which is a mechanistic, fundamentally mechanistic notion of nature as devoid of mind, of thought, of reason, of discourse, of awareness, of the light of the understanding. Nature, for modern man, does not understand anything. It does not mean anything. The rose doesn't mean anything for modern man. Right? Even art does not mean anything. If nature doesn't mean anything, how can art, human art, mean anything? If divine nature doesn't mean anything, our art means nothing. And that's how we end up with garbage paraded as beautiful, as delightful, because it pleases us in our sense of certainty that there is fundamentally no meaning to life, to nature. Well, you might say this is liberating. There is an emancipation of man, of our will, an emancipation of freedom, a coming of age, in other words, of freedom in the modern world. And yet, this emancipation is made possible by subservience to a machine, an overarching machine that guarantees the great guarantor, the big brother who is the guarantor of freedom for all. Freedom to do what? Freedom for what? Well, self-expression of meaninglessness. Meaningless self-expression of meaninglessness. Well, we can pretend to be given the absence of any real being. There is no God. There is no beyond. It's all sensual. It's all in the flux. This is historicism in academic terms, which is to say the doctrine that there is no beyond. We have reconstructions of pagan antiquity, reconstructions that tell us that, the ancients, even the Greeks, had no metaphysics before they invented metaphysics. In other words, there was no beyond. It was all about appreciating the flux of things, of nature, the sentiment, the experience. But this is an altogether thoroughly modern conception that is then projected upon antiquity. The ancients were stern. quite stern. Sterner than we will ever be, probably. They stood for honor vis-a-vis the dead. Their life was centered upon the dead. Man was immortal, meaning that he faced death, and death was the beyond. Death was not just a moment, but the whole realm of the dead. We don't have tombs and hymns to the dead for nothing. And who presided over the dead? The gods. We even have a god whose name is Death in Greek. So, let us consider now the moderns. What kind of language does nature have for the moderns? Well, given Christianity, given also problems, complications, we never escape problems in the modern world that Christianity carries within its bosom, philosophers such as Machiavelli or Galileo or Descartes later respond with a novel notion of nature, of reconstruction, especially in the case of Machiavelli, of classical antiquity, of the ancients and in general of pagan antiquity. A reconstruction that tells us that we do not need a reference to the gods or God to understand nature. Very simple. Very simple. We don't need ends to understand the means. The means are power. Power is the name of the game. The powers. There's no meaning, there's no realm of intelligibility beyond appearances. Life is all about struggle for power. And once we understand this, we're at home in the world. Justice is integration in the play, in the flux of power. Well, what's wrong with that? Knaves of all sorts will rejoice. The victims of knaves, not so much. They will tend to appeal to something that is fundamentally right, or what we traditionally call natural right. What is right? By nature, in itself, in and of itself. What the king says, what the flux is telling us, is not necessarily right. The fact that something is happening doesn't make it right. What makes it right? And so we have accord with a standard. What's that standard? The flux? No, it won't work. It won't work. So all modern returns to ancient paganism, framed in these terms that we've just outlined, are bankrupt. They not only return to a phantom, they bring with them, if only surreptitiously, technology as the great guarantor, the machine that guarantees the return, supposed, the reconstruction of antiquity, ultimately integration in the flux. We can all be integrated in the flux thanks to the machine, thanks to the modern machine, technology. All right, but now the early moderns respond to Christianity, and they say, Christianity doesn't give us nature itself, it gives us a whole infrastructure of words, theological discourse that blinds us to the truth about nature. Well, the truth about nature, as Socrates pointed out, the truth about nature is something hidden, which you access through poetry, and Christianity is sacred poetry. It is the poetry of poetry. It is not only poetry, but the defense, the apologia of poetry, of good poetry, against fake poetry. So, these are necessarily problems that we face. as human beings. So, what does the modern do or say? He says, we have nature aside from the gods. So, he gets rid of God number one, the biblical God, especially, but also the other gods, and says, well, look, those gods are just imaginary. They're just fantasy, and they're fine as long as you understand them in Disney terms, right? They're entertainment. But really, we have the experience of nature, which again is guaranteed by the modern physical sciences. But we shouldn't give too much credit to them because they're just there to help us have this experience, this sentiment, enjoy nature, right? Live in the flux, be Epicureans, have a party, get drunk. All of this is guaranteed by the machine. The machine should not, however, tell us what to do ultimately. It should just allow us to party, to enjoy ourselves, and to proclaim the ultimate meaninglessness of life. Lovely or not. But now, the modern project is based in part on this notion that we have access to the language of nature. Galileo Galilei says nature is an open book. And we can all, whether you're bad or good, an angel or demon, we can all access this book, read it, because it's written in the language of modern symbolic mathematics. Again, mathematics, we have a new concept of mathematics in the modern world of symbolic forms that are abstracted from ontology, from the question of the divine, of the otherworldly. Take, for example, Pythagoras. Well, numbers have meaning. In the modern context, numbers mean nothing. 1, 2, 3, 4. The modern speaks of numbers, of math, in mercenary terms, not in philosophical terms, or in the terms that were praised by the ancients. Right? So 1 is primarily first. And so it's greater than 2 for the ancients. And it stands for God. And 3 is at a further removal from the 1. Right? And so you have the many, all the numbers together are infinitely smaller than 1, which is the unity which embraces all the numbers. So all numbers mean something. And ultimately they mean one thing, the 1. And the mystery of the 1, which is something that is not even a number. All right. So, what do the moderns say? Galileo says, nature is an open book, mathematical, ultimately a machine, a great clock. A clock that is so complex that it defies our own puny, miserable, human, mechanistic limitations. In other words, it's not an ordinary machine. It's a super machine. It's a machine whence life arises. So it's a machine that is beyond our capacity to understand, really. But we can decipher the mechanisms in a pragmatic manner, so that we can use those mechanisms to enjoy ourselves, to empower ourselves. Right? When we empower ourselves, we can enjoy ourselves more. Right? So, we can use this huge, unfathomable machine to create our own machines that will allow us to have a party, to fantasize, to have dreams about meaning and construct meaning and a new society based on this notion that we construct meaning out of nothing, almost as God, as a biblical God, almost. So that's where we're at now, and is that a good place? And many will rest satisfied with this and will flatter themselves into believing that it's perfectly fine. And yet complain about technology being tyrannical, taking over, without recognizing that they're entrusting their freedom to technology. which is not only a machine, a tangible machine, but also a logic, and primarily a logic, that dominates our lives. So we're all free now in a cage. And the smaller the cage, the freer we are. Because the safer we are to dream, to fantasize about meaning, to construct meaning. Virtual, of course. It's all virtual. Freedom is virtual. It's a pretense. Once we're faced with the exposure of all of this nonsense, we begin to have, to awaken to a sense that there must be something beyond that is more important than any of this nonsense, and in all of this flux of experiences, of enjoyment. Those who awaken to this sense, this doubt of the beyond, not the beyond posited geometrically, a la Spinoza, right, only to be used to serve an Epicurean cause, but a beyond in the respect that it transcends experience, myself, my enjoyment, a beyond in the respect that it calls me as a human being to journey, not in the direction of enjoyment, of the establishment of a new Babel society, but in the direction of the pure understanding, so that we may all meet not in the vehicle of technology, but in the vehicle of thought. We do not communicate fundamentally via technology. This is just the instrument is just how should we put it? It is accidentally there. Yeah. In reality, the instrument is to be understood in the context of a mind. Without the mind, there would be no instrument. A certain drive, so-called materialistic drive in the modern world, has us believe that what is material, tangible, is just there, independently of mind. Well, that is simply absurd, given that it's something that we speak of and that someone's speaking of. There is no experience without the logos. Experiencing what? You name it, you point to it. But the pointer is a logos. Now, what is critical here is that with the modern, you have the establishment of a mechanistic universe that goes, of course, hand in hand with this vitalistic, this sentimental view approach to nature. Nature is assumed to be an open book at first, again Galileo. Its language is that of symbolic mathematics, so essentially it's the language of a machine, devoid of meaning, of intelligence, really. Intelligence here is simply the structuring of the machine. And this is where we stand today. Can we hear the language of nature? We have to go to the experts, the scientists, so-called scientists, to hear the language of nature. But this modern science won't give us everything. So Galileo we don't go along with him 100%. We say that he is instrumental, he is useful. Modern science is useful. It doesn't give us absolute truth. Useful for us to fantasize about the language of nature. We have our perspectives, our points of view, our experiences, which are historically contingent, as we often say. No absolute truth. No univocal language logos of nature. We've renounced that. We've given up on that. And we end up with technocracy. Again, if we're not satisfied with this, there's a good reason for it. We're not born for it. We're not born. Nature does not generate us, as it were. We're not created. We're not made for this. What are we made for? Well, the alternative to the mechanistic universe that goes along with the sentimental notion of nature is the classical Socratic Platonic notion of nature speaking through poets. And the poets allow us to see that nature is not just a flux, not just powers, but mind fundamentally. Fundamentally the principle of nature. So it's, then the question of the nature of nature comes up, right, in discourse, in human discourse. And now we begin to see that, there is a mind beyond the flux. This mind is immutable. We're not talking about a symbolic eternity, a mathematical geometric, Spinoza's eternity. We're not speaking about an as if, in Kantian terms, we imagine it. We're speaking of what is fundamentally within itself, being beyond semblance. Necessarily, we have to distinguish at this point what is ultimately the case from lies, deception, the world of deception. Once we abandon this distinction, we end up in the flux, in the absurdity of Maoists, of communists, of historicists, of Heidegger, of Nietzscheans, of everyone else today who feeds into this doctrine or ideology of perspective, of perspectivism, subjectivity, and so forth, of the flux. This has very little to do with the ancient flux, which was contemplative, Heraclitus, Democritus as well, contemplative, and that does not seek to establish a new world where everybody's in harmony with everybody else, dreaming thanks to the great machine. That's a monstrosity that the ancient philosophers of nature would have abhorred as the worst of evils. Well, here we have it. Is it through poetry or through the machine that we are to relate to nature? The answer lies at the bottom, in fact, speaks to us from the bottom of our soul.